For this special programme, to mark the 2000th letter from America, many of you will have heard it, I'm in London and Alistair Cooke is in the BBC studio in New York. Hello, Alistair. Are you hearing us?
Very well, thank you.
Right, I'll be back with you in a moment, Alistair, after I talk briefly not to you, but about you. Alistair Cooke was born in Manchester of English and Irish parents. After university in Cambridge, England, and at Harvard and Yale in America, he worked in Hollywood with Charlie Chaplin and returned to Britain to become a film critic for the BBC. In 1936, he broadcast a series of letters from London for the American network NBC. Among other things, he covered the crisis touched off by King Edward VIII's love affair with the divorced American Mrs. Simpson, the crisis that ended with the King's abdication. So great was American interest in this royal drama that Cooke was sending NBC a flood of London letters, up to 8 or 10, he tells me, every day. In 1937, he went to America as correspondent of the London Times and later of the Manchester Guardian. He was to stay with the Guardian for 25 years. Then, in 1946, the BBC asked him to do a short run of letters from America. Talk about anything, he was told. And so he has. American politics, jazz and the arts, organised crime, golf, and the beauty of New England in the fall. Cooke has written several books. His television series, America, has been seen all around the world. And many of you will have heard his series on American music. His latest, on Gershwin, is going out at present on Radio 4. And now, if you've got a question for Alistair Cooke, the number to ring is London 580-4444 or London 580-4411. Let's go now to the first caller, who is Mrs. Christine Michael in Milton Keynes in England. Mrs. Michael, would you like to put your question to Alistair Cooke in New York?
Yes, indeed. Good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning.
The question I'd like to ask you is, which elements of the British culture do you value most? And after your long residence in the USA, where do your loyalties lie?
Well, everybody says my loyalties lie in mid-Atlantic, but they are, as Othello said, I do perceive here a divided loyalty between Britain and America. However, it's not a conflict. I'm at home in both countries, and I think the best thing that's come out of spending so many years in this country talking about it, in the first place to a British audience and then to foreign audiences, has been to enjoy watching two variations of the same culture at work and play.
Sorry, can I come back and ask you?
Go ahead, Mrs. Michael, yes.
Yes. I've lived and worked in the United States myself for a short time, about 5 or 6 years. And during the time I was there, I found that I went through a sort of psychological bereavement process almost, if you like, where you have to sort of evaluate very carefully what you've left behind and what you've, the new culture that you've adopted. And the things that I found I missed most about the United Kingdom were things which we take very much for granted here, which I haven't seen a lot of evidence of in the USA. One of those was the health service. I wondered if you could tell us about something about the health service and the way it's developing in the United States. Is there any evidence that it's becoming a more caring and less money-oriented service, you feel?
Well, it's existed for the longest time, the theory of what's called health insurance, which really, I think, ought to be called sickness insurance, has been going on certainly since the 1930s, and I think everyone I know has some, I think you call it kind of thing Bupa. There are several systems to which you subscribe, and I know, for instance, in my own case, that one of them takes care of hospital, being in the hospital, another one takes care of surgery, another takes care of general medicine. And of course, if you are over 65, Medicare is a national system which pays most of the services that attend any illness. Then each state has something called Medicaid, which is a a state service, state in the American sense being whether you live in Arkansas, or you live in Illinois, you live in California or New York State. And the people who really miss out are the people who have not at any time subscribed, paid out insurance to those services. The people who have, however, who will get total care in catastrophic illnesses are the very poor who can afford nothing, and they do get it.
Alastair, is there a tendency in America still to equate the welfare state with socialism, do you think, or is that receding?
Well, it's an awfully good question. I think there has been a tendency. When the Social Security system was established by Roosevelt in the 1930s, there was an enormous outcry from the Republicans. It was called galloping socialism. And in this country, the name socialism always galloped. It never crawled. And then when it was well established, the Republicans came along and said, well, of course, it's absolutely essential to do this, but we'll do it better. And the Republican Party became known as the Me Too Party. Now, what's happened in the past 20 years is that the big changes, whether for good or ill, have been made mainly by the Republican Party, especially in the last 8 years. And the Democrats are now in the strange position of being the Me Too Party. They agree, of course, we must have less taxes, especially for defense, they say, and the president says more. But we'll do the system better, and that's been the big seesaw.
Thank you, Mrs. Michael, for your question. Let's go on now to Israel, to Mr. Nat Lee in Herzliya. Mr. Lee, go ahead with your question to Alistair Cooke.
Good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning to you, sir.
Do you agree, Mr. Cooke, that the manner in which the Iran-Gate investigations are being handled by the media, Senate and Congress are doing immense damage to America, and would it not have been far better to have handled this on a low-profile investigation?
Well, I don't know what a low-profile investigation would be, because in the American system, the Congress was set up in the very beginning as a watchdog of executive power. And when the Constitution was written, 1787, when they had the big 6-week debate to say what it should be, James Madison, of all people who'd looked into all the different systems of government around the world, pointed out that in every country on earth, the war-making power belonged with the executive, with the king, with the tyrant, with whoever he was. And he said that since they'd had experience with George III, this must not be. We can make the president the commander-in-chief, but the Congress, and it's written into the Constitution, must have the power to declare war and to raise armies, which means, of course, the money that goes into raising armies. And really what the whole investigation about is the very serious matter of the war powers of the president. And I think, even though it's interminable, it's absolutely an essential American device for checking excessive power in the president.
Any comment, Mr. Lee, on that?
Yes, well, I understand that. The only thing is that when you open up the workings of the CIA and the various intelligence authorities to the world and wash your linen in public, you're feeding a lot of information to your enemies which can do immense damage. It also lowers the estimate of your friends about you.
That is true, and that is one of the great problems that face democracies everywhere today, which is finally, because for so long we went on assuming that there was something called a secret service in most countries, didn't know how it behaved. Since the Freedom of Information Act was passed in this country about 10 years ago, anybody can go to Washington and find out what the FBI, what the CIA said about him in any secret memo. So we have opened up the whole business of how covert can covert operations be and still operate within the Constitution and the powers of the Congress. And it's true, it's a problem. It's a problem between open democracy and the need to have covert operations. And this is happening now in all democratic countries.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Now, back to Britain with a question from Mr. George Roudet, the ancient port of Rye on the English south coast. Mr. Roudet, go ahead, will you?
Good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning, sir.
I believe that when President Nixon was impeached for his various misdemeanors, that you were one of his stern critics, as I remember, and you supported that impeachment. Am I
Yes.
right? That's
Yes,
only the
indeed.
beginning. If that is so, do you think that in view of the present situation of President Reagan, if he can be found, in fact, to have had his hand on the smoking gun, do you think the same fate should be done to him as was done to Professor Nixon? That is, that the threat of impeachment should in fact be carried out.
Well, I don't know what should be done, but I can only say that so far, and of course the President is the first to insist that there is no smoking gun. Nixon was found guilty, again, according to the careful definition of the Constitution, for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, with Reagan at the moment, there is the curious contradiction that now I think it's something like 62 or 3% at least of the people suspect that he was lying, that he did know about the transfer of funds from Iran to the Contras, whereas 68% of the people say they still think he's a nice man. And this is this very curious situation in which he's a very popular man. Richard Nixon was not popular, was suspect at all times. But we're getting to the point now when we hear from the two main witnesses, Poindexter and North, where if it's proved that the president did know about the transfer of funds, well, then already several members of the joint committees, mainly Democrats, but some Republicans too, are beginning to talk about articles of impeachment. I doubt it will happen because he has so little time to go. The impeachment proceedings would take so long to go through the House Judiciary Committee, which is the one that finds the indictment, and then you get tried in the Senate. By the time the trial came up in the Senate, I think that Reagan's days would be over. I mean, his professional days as president.
Mr. Roudet, have you any comment you want to?
Well, I would just like to say that I have read in newspapers here that it might be inexpedient, not because they don't think that he may be behind the smoking gun, they would think that his necessary immediate successor would be Vice President Bush, which would limit the chances possibly of the Democrats getting a suitable candidate in quickly. Also, that it might make it difficult to have those very necessary negotiations with the Soviet Union on nuclear arms control, which both President Reagan and others are in favor of in the course of this year, at least they say they are. Do you think this should play a part in one's attitude to the yay or nay of severe action against Reagan, apart from the fact that, as you explained, that he has a comparatively short term to run anyway?
Well, I think your question has put admirably the answer. There is the political factor that most people are anxious to find a medium-range agreement with the Soviet Union. And I should guess that one thing that stands in the way of the discovery of a smoking gun is the fact that the main law that Reagan is accused of violating is this law that was passed by the Congress called the Boland Amendment, which said that there should be no arms sold or money raised to sell arms to the Contras by any member of the intelligence services or any groups or individuals. Now, it's a terribly badly worded amendment. People have argued, does groups or individuals mean only inside the intelligence services or private groups or individuals? The President interprets it in the latter way, so that he says, I'm not covered by the Boland Amendment. It's a very poorly written law, and I think that there certainly is an escape hatch for him there.
Thank you, Mr.
But
Rude.
you're absolutely right. A paramount consideration is not to cripple him for the possibility of making some agreement or treaty with the Soviet Union.
Sorry, Alastair, to interrupt you. Thank you, Mr. Rude. We're going on now to a related question in some ways, to West Berlin, and the questioner is Miss Helen Tate. Miss Tate, please go ahead.
Oh, hello, Mr. Cooke. I'm delighted
Hello.
to talk to you, and thanks for all those wonderful letters.
Thank you.
If you had the power to control the United States foreign policy, what changes would you make?
Well, it's never been put up to me, but I must say that I think, first of all, in the executive branch, I would make the Secretary of State the absolutely commanding power, which he used to be. One of the problems since the time of, really it started with Truman starting the Defense Department and giving special separate powers to the Secretary of Defense. It went through Kennedy, and ever since we've really had two Secretaries of State, and they've been very often in conflict between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State. Now we learn that the CIA has been given extraordinary powers, and covert activity has gone beyond what many people in Congress think it should. So then they invented an intelligence oversight committee, which should have been overseeing committee, to limit covert activity or have it reported to them. So in a way, we now have three State Departments, and two of them operating on the surface in the open, and one of them covertly. And I would simply reassert the power of the State Department and see that the Secretary of State is the main link with the President and the main conductor of foreign policy.
Alastair, could this not be done simply by the President asserting a bit more authority and saying to the other members of the Cabinet, the Secretary of State is my chief advisor in foreign affairs, please keep your mouth shut?
Ah, that would be splendid, and it's exactly what happened, for instance, with Franklin Roosevelt. What you have, I think, in American history is a succession, is an alternation, if you like, of very powerful presidents who become their own Secretaries of State. And then you have, this was very true of Roosevelt, with Cordell Hull really doing what Roosevelt said. Then you have Eisenhower, who had John Foster Dulles, who was really running presidential power in the State Department. And what you have with Reagan is we've developed in the meantime such an enormous bureaucracy, or rather a series, a whole fringe of bureaucracies handling intelligence, handling foreign policy, that this provides a great temptation for the President to hear not two sides, but 16 sides to every question, and go with the one he likes. And this can very often, as we've seen, undercut the power of the Secretary of Defense, of the National Security Advisor, he's another one, of the Secretary of State.
But what I would like to know is, if you had that ultimate power now, let's say, wherever the final decision lies, that you had this wonderful, it could be from outer space, you have this influence that you could get into their minds and have them do just what you, and in your present frame of mind, what you would like done. In short, your mind overpowers the mind of whoever is in ultimate control.
The trouble is, you see, that under the Constitution, nobody's in ultimate control. I should like very much to be a benign dictator, but that's what you'd have to be. You'd have to tear up the Constitution and say this is what you've got to do.
Ms. Tate, thank you for your question. We're now going to Mr. Monty Rubin in Africa, in Nairobi in Kenya. Mr. Rubin, please put your question to Alistair Cooke.
Good morning, Alistair.
Good morning.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how would a post-war American president?
Post-war? Well, all right. I should say On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say Harry Truman was 7. I would say Eisenhower was 5. I would say very difficult to give a score to Kennedy because of his popularity and the sort of boost he gave to American morale around the world. But as an effective president, it sounds cold-blooded to say so, but if he had not died, I think it would have been seen that he would have been, let's say, 4, because when he died, he had over 90 bills which were shelved. He simply could not get them through Congress because he was very, very bad at coaxing and conniving and persuading Congress. I would put Lyndon Johnson at certainly 7. Unfortunately, he was weighed down and eventually defeated by the albatross of Vietnam. But domestically, Lyndon Johnson seems to me to be one of the great presidents of the post-war era.
Mr. Rubin, how would you put the score? Who would be your favourite?
Well, it's really very for me to answer because I have no objective basis on which to judge them. But I wonder what Alistair Cooke would say about Carter, Ford, Nixon, and Reagan.
Well, all right. Carter is certainly one of the most intelligent and intellectual presidents we've had. I think the great trouble with Carter was that he was too wedded to what Nehru called the Hindu view of truth, which is that you don't see 2 sides to every question, you see 5. And his problem was that he got into all the detail, he weighed everything so much that he was incapable of action. I would give him a 5. He did very good things, but he had a weakness which is a great strength in Reagan, which is however much he befuddles the facts or is misinformed, he is positive. He knows what he wants and he insists on it. And I don't really know how to score Reagan. I should say that Ford was probably a greatly underestimated man, very well-balanced man, and remember, he really was a kind of caretaker, a healer of the great wound of Watergate.
Mr. Rubin, thank you for your question. Now, let's leave politics for a moment and go to Mr. John Cuse in Danbury, Essex, here in England. Mr. Cuse, your question to Alistair Cooke, if you will.
Good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning.
Really, I'm interested in knowing where and when do you normally write your weekly letter? Or do you just talk into a tape recorder off the cuff, as it were?
Well, you know, that is, I have to say, that's always the greatest compliment that anyone can pay. They say you just sit in front of the microphone and you talk for 13 minutes and 42 seconds. I have been doing it a long time, and I am able by now to feel in my bloodstream just when it ought to be coming to an end. But I regret to have to tell you that I do write it, and then I sort of, as the professionals in television and radio say, wing it. In other words, you change an adjective here and there. But normally, in fact, most of the time, I sit down on Thursdays. It's taped in New York and then flown to England and then played around the world. I sit down about, I would say, 11 in the morning is a comfortable time. And then I do type out good evening, and I also type out good morning for people who are hearing it in the morning. And then, quite honestly, I say, now what? Because I do trust to free association. This is not being casual or glib about it. I used to, in the old days, make notes all through the week about what I felt it would be responsible to talk about. But then I realized after several years that when you go to a dinner party or have a drink with a friend, you don't walk in with little cards. There have been presidents who've done that. But you don't walk in with an agenda of what you talk about. It will be not good talk if you do that. So I prefer to trust to my unconscious, automatic memory, whatever, and think of something that happened. Of course, if a president is about to abdicate, you're going to talk about that. But most of the time I simply do not know when I sit down, and it comes out, takes about 2 hours, then I come down to the BBC and do it.
Thank you, Mr. Skuse. Now let's go all the way to Asia, to Mr. Michael Hendy in Kuala Kangsar in West Malaysia. Mr. Hendy, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to ask a question concerning the language that you use, Mr. Cooke, as an observer of language and also a user. Have you noticed changes in how the English language is used over the years you've been broadcasting the letters?
I didn't get the key word. Have I noticed what?
Changes in the style of the English language as she is spoke.
Changes, Alistair.
Changes.
Changes, yes. The line is crackling
yes,
a
of
bit.
course, enormous changes, because language is always changing. And of all languages, English is a mongrel. It always has been since the very beginning with the Indo-European, and it brought in Saxon and German and the Latin languages, and it had Persian and Farsi and Indian words. And of course, in fact, for over 300 years, American words have been crossing the Atlantic. The very first man, in I think 1636, there was a man named Francis Moore, who is immortal because he was the first Englishman who went back to England and protested about American words. And the first example we know is that he had lived in Tidewater, Maryland. He didn't know the word Tidewater then. He went back and he said that he lived on the peak, a point going into the bay, he said, which I would call a bank, and which they, in barbarous English, call a bluff. Well, ever since then, the languages have been flowing back and forth, but mainly, I think, from America towards England, and Americanisms get absorbed at such a rate that I think the only way people in England, for instance, can recognize an Americanism is one that came in their time. Now, by that I mean, I doubt that very many people listening to me would object to the word scientist, which was an Americanism resisted at the point of a sword when it got to England, because English people said a man of science. Another word was the word reliable. They thought that was frightful, because the English word was trustworthy. And this has been going on so long that I often like to kid young Englishmen who talk about keeping the language pure, that if you have a conversation of 15 minutes with them, they use 100 Americanisms which they don't know as such because they came in 1840 or 1890 or 1930 or whatever.
Alastair, it's interesting you should mention these impurities, the latest of which that worries me is the use of the word convince when people mean persuade. Now, that started in the States, and I've even seen it on the front page of the Times and heard it on the BBC. It's appalling.
And it will, and it's there for good. There's nothing you can do about it.
Did you ever do an American letter on this place in Maryland, where there's an island, I think it's called Tiger Island, or is it Assateague, where they still speak
yes. English
American after all these years?
Well, you know, there's always a theory about the Appalachian Mountains, and inside some of those fastnesses, those fortresses, they talk about people speaking Elizabethan English. I did some work once when the American scholars were putting together a vast work in the 30s known as the American Linguistic Atlas. Went down to Chincoteague, went into the Appalachians, and there is a dialect, I suppose you'd call it, a variation of English, spoken in what then was a very enclosed compound in a valley between two mountains, of the Gullah. It's known as the Gullah dialect, and this was mostly black people who had retained over, 4 or 5 centuries, an extraordinary medieval form, it's Chaucerian form, which is Y-bin. Ibin means there was. Once Ibin, a young man with a yellow torso, and whenever they had a possessive, it was Ibin. This has vanished, I think, now with the spread of radio, television, and also the spread of suburbs and what they now call mega counties. But I'm afraid that anybody looking for the purity of English should have objected when Chaucer, who was a customs inspector, remember, had great dealings with the French, and he brought into the English language so many French words that at the time a great deal of Chaucer could only be read by people who today would be familiar with James Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Hendy in Malaysia. Now we're going to go to the town of Salford, significantly, in England, to hear from Mr. Leslie Reich. He says. Mr. Reich, please put your question.
Hello, Mr. Cooke.
Hello.
The chairman introduced you as being born in Manchester.
I know.
In fact, there was a local brewery advertisement which advertised the people who had done well who were born in Salford, and you were listed amongst them. And
Quite right.
I was wondering if, first of all, you could tell us where exactly you were born in Salford. From where I'm speaking at the moment, I've been born and lived there for over 50 years.
Well, it was in Seedley. Now, we always said Manchester because in those days Salford was a part of Manchester. I mean, I was astonished in about 10 years ago, a little more, to discover that there was a University of Salford. When I was a boy, there was, I think, not even a University of Manchester. It was known in my day as Owen's College.
Yeah.
Eventually became the University of Manchester. But all these petticoat suburbs of Manchester, including Seedley, which is part of Salford, we didn't say I was born in Seedley. Nobody knew where it was. So it was simple, and also it was proud to say that you were a Mancunian, because we always enjoyed through schoolmasters hearing that Mancunium was the northern capital of England, of Roman England.
I believe that, like myself, you went on to Manchester Grammar School, and I was wondering what effect...
No, I went to Blackpool, which
see.
was then called Blackpool School. It was a grammar school, I suppose. It was secondary, but it liked to call itself, thanks to the rather eccentric headmaster, Blackpool School.
Mr. Reich, do you detect any of the Salford influence in Mr. Cooke's writings and talks?
I've been a regular listener and reader of his in The Guardian in early days for many years. This was really the question I wanted to put to Mr. Cooke, to ask him what effect his Lancashire upbringing had had on his subsequent career. I've not been able to detect anything.
Well, you see, it's a question of character. We always like to say that we're downright and forthright, and I'm very dubious always about national character, and especially about regional character. But a famous actor, who shall be nameless, once said to me, who is a southerner, an English southerner, that he married a Lancashire woman because he said there's no nonsense about them and they cut through all the la-di-da.
Yeah.
I like that. I like to think it's true.
Thank you, Mr. Reich, for your question. We learnt a lot from that we didn't know before. Now let's go to Stockholm in Sweden to Mr. Beneb Framson. Mr. Framson, please put your question to Alistair Cooke.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning.
Yes, I would like to ask you a short question. I have listened to many of your wonderful letters from America, and through that I know that you have met many interesting people, and I would like to know who is the most interesting person that you have met.
Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
There have been so many
Yes.
down 50 years that most interesting. As a matter of fact, two people come to mind.
Yes.
I think of prominent people. The most unforgettable to me is the man I often refer to as my guru, H.L. Mencken, the Baltimore journalist, who in his time in this country was as famous as George Bernard Shaw was in England. I still think he is the master American journalist of this century. But then there is a tendency, as you see, to say, oh, most interesting, what about Roosevelt? Yes, great. But I think the second most interesting man I ever met was a man named Donovan Rouse. He was a Cornishman who came to this country when he was about 17. I met him when he was in his late 40s, and he came to work for the BBC. And he has remained to this day an incredible eccentric with a gift of language. He was something of a cynic. Unfortunately, I used to ask him to sit down and write his comments on life. And he did one day, and I said, you should send them to the New Yorker. And I looked at this, and it was absolutely appalling. He could not put it on paper. But he remains to me a very affectionate memory. He was in this office for about 25 years, and his comments on everything, during the war, after the war, were indelible. And if we ever got together, I could give you some of them, but some of them would not be publishable over Radio 4 or the World Service.
Thank you, Mr. Framson in Stockholm. I'm going to go on now, because we haven't got very much time left and we've got a pile of questions waiting, to Mr. Alan Franks in Brighton, Sussex. Mr. Franks, would you like to put your question to Alistair Cooke?
Good morning, Mr. Cooke.
Good morning.
As you know, we've just had an election campaign which has lasted roughly a month. Do you feel in 1987 that the American campaign should go on for so long, with so much hype and cost so much money, and what changes would you make to the system?
Well, since the late 1930s, there have been bills passed by Congress, successive bills to try and cut down the amount of money that's allowed for candidates to use. It's never been successful, and the only explanation I can give is that here you have in this country, remember, 50 governments, 50 states with great separate powers, criminal codes, banking laws, educational systems, and it's very much up to the states, and the federal controls have not been very effective. In fact, most thoughtful Americans who know the parliamentary system, they yearn to have something that goes on for 3 weeks, but they don't think, and I think for rather complicated, as I say, continental reasons, it simply would be impossible. And it's part of the... You also have to remember that this country has about, 85, 100 and something different peoples of different national origins who've never known a parliamentary system. They get very excited every 2 years to look forward another 2 years to find the new Moses. This is part, I think, of American idealism, which is also part of hyped up idealism. They're looking for Moses, the great deliverer. And then they find him, and then he's in the White House for 2 years, and then they discover he's not Moses. So then they start looking for another one.
Thank you, Mr. Franks. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we've got very little time left, and Mr. Kenneth Lawson in Manchester is waiting to talk to Alistair Cooke. Please go ahead.
Hello there. Good morning, Alistair.
Good morning.
Accepting that jazz is an American product, and it has an international language, and appeals to something that we both have a passion about, the interest of jazz. Which three jazz musicians do you admire the most for their lifelong and worldwide contribution?
Oh, dear. Well, I can think of two, though I don't know about worldwide, but Big Spiderbeck. I think nobody's ever played a cornet like him. Jack Teagarden on trombone, and I would say Earl Hines on piano.
Very interesting. That's great.
Are they your choices?
No, but they're three of my six. I couldn't manage to edit it down to three. I happen to have Armstrong, Ellington, and...
Oh yes, Ellington. Ellington should have been in there, of course, as the great composer.
I suppose
jazz.
Springing it on you like that, it's difficult.
Quite right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson in Manchester. Now, Mr. Geoffrey Welton in Cambridge. Your question, please, to Alistair Cooke.
Mr. Cooke, good morning to you.
Yes, good morning.
Mr. Cooke, I wonder, you've lived in America these many years, you have travelled extensively. The country is represented in this country, in the popular press, as being a dangerous place to visit for holidaymakers. I wonder whether you would be able to disabuse our popular press of that notion.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I do think that there are people who say to me, is it safe for me to go to New York, which is absurd to a New Yorker. I mean, obviously there are places in town that you would not walk around at 2 o'clock in the morning. Same thing is true, by the way, of, I don't think people go on a holiday to the Gorbals. But, and there are parts of London, though I think it's very much safer. But Detroit, for instance, has a very bad reputation. Phoenix, Arizona, much, much worse than New York. But I think the chances of being mugged or attacked in New York are about possibly 1 in 200,000. Of course, unfortunately, from time to time, a stranger appears. Just been a Pole who, for instance, came here 8 months ago and was attacked, and says that he doesn't hold it against America. He just thinks it was bad luck. Well, that shows extraordinary magnanimity.
Alastair, mugging, of course, is not the only form of violence. What about the death penalty in the United States? What about the number of murders, shootings, the gun laws, and so on?
Oh, dear, that is such a complicated question. In the state, this again, you see, is state law. And as you know, the states are very different. I think in Texas, I think 3 people were executed in the past month. Whenever it comes to the Supreme Court, which all questions which violate individual rights do, it has to be the circumstances under which the crime was committed. Whether, for instance, you went out and shot a policeman. And there are so many variations of culpability that each case has to be taken on its merits. And there's no way, it seems to me at the moment, in the American system, that there could be a national law outlawing the death penalty. It keeps coming up in different states, and then they find the Supreme Court rules that under certain circumstances you may not have the death penalty. Under certain other circumstances you may.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Welton, for that question. Let's go now to Mrs. Madge Powell in Birmingham. Please put your question, and it may be the last, to Alistair Cooke.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Cooke.
Good afternoon.
I wonder if you can remember who first influenced your great love of jazz and of golf. Could it have been Bing Crosby?
It could have been, but it wasn't. I was fairly close to him as a golfing companion. But first love of jazz, well, that came from a roommate of mine at Cambridge who subsequently went into the diplomatic service. Up to that point, I had been very fond of musical comedy, what they call show tunes, and I think he took me in hand and introduced me to all the great jazz men of the late 20s. He was the jazz critic on the University magazine. I think he was the main influence. Golf really was my wife, who has never played golf and never intends to, but there came a day 20-some years ago when she pointed out to me that if I stayed at my typewriter all through the winter and the summer, I would turn into a typewriter arthritic, and it was already happening. And she said, "You've always mooned from trains at watching people walk over beautiful green fairways. Why don't you take up golf?" And I called up the nearest club, and I said, "Is there a pro?" And they said, "Yes, there is." And he was a little old Scotsman who came over in 1919 to teach the colonials, as we say. And I went to him, and he said, "Take a 7-iron." And he apparently knew me from television. And he said, "Mr. Cooke, what seems to be the problem?" And I said, "Well, which end do you hold?" So he said, "Dear me." So we started from scratch. Excuse me, golf is a game where you do not start from scratch.
Alistair, you obviously are a golfer. Do you blow any instruments, thump any instruments, play any instruments?
Well, I'm absolutely shocked, Charles, to hear that you don't have my long-playing Columbia record called An Evening with Alistair Cooke at the Piano. It's 45 minutes of all kinds of things.
I'll get it out of the BBC library this afternoon.
You must do it at once. It's now known as a collector's item, which is a record that sells at an appalling price because originally it didn't sell.
Well, thank you, Alistair. That's all we have time for. We've had
Thank you,
an
Charles.
enormous number of calls. Not only questions, Alistair, but messages from admirers and friends of yours, and we're sorry that we couldn't get them all on the air. I apologise to any callers I may have cut off in order to keep the programme going and moving along. And with that, from all of us in London, it's goodbye.